The authority problem is central to A Course in Miracles, to its curriculum. This is a quote directly from the Course. I have spoken of different symptoms, and at that level there is almost endless variation. There is, however, only one cause for all of them, the authority problem. That is the root of all evil. So the authority problem relates to the Course's metaphysics, its story of creation, its myth of creation. So in the myth, first of all, there was oneness. And that oneness consisted of God, the Creator, and the sonship, his creations. But the Course also says at no place was there a part where you could tell where the Father ended and the sonship began. So oneness is the key term to do with our reality and the essential beginnings of things. Now, into this oneness, a part of that sonship seemed to fall asleep and have a dream in which it was separate to its creator. And along with this perception of difference, of separation, was the idea that they were the created and not the creator. So they were equal to God in every aspect. They were a part of the essential same oneness. But that one thing, that one factor of being the created and not the creator, seemed to play on this aspect of the sonship's mind. Of course, this couldn't happen, and that's the good news of the Course, that it's just as if a part of that sonship fell asleep and had a dream that all this occurred. And that part of that sonship is all of us. So having become aware of some difference between ourselves and God, and that being that he is the creator and we were the created, we then made a decision about that. We decided it wasn't fair. We placed a value judgment on it. We decided it wasn't fair and that really we should have the capacity to create ourselves, to create who we are, or even to create God, to be the creator. This was how the authority problem was born. The Course says this: the ego was made out of a wish of God's Son to father him, to father God. And so from this perception of difference and the value judgment that it wasn't fair, we made our own God. We created the idea of God as an unloving father, a tyrant who lorded it over us. Ultimately, we saw ourselves in competition with God in terms of authority over us. Who has authority over us? God, the tyrant, the great overlord, or us? Are we the boss of us, or is he the boss of us? Now we can see two main reactions to this idea that God is a tyrant, an overlord, and that we're in competition with him regarding our authority, or who is the boss of us. One is to rebel against that, say, I'm not a slave to God. I'm not going to be a slave to his dictates, to his will. I'm going to be a self-made person. The other is to be fearful of that tyrant, that God, and to say, I'm going to be a perfect individual. I'm going to be good. I'm going to toe the line. I'm going to operate within all the boundaries of society. I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to be good. And this way, God won't punish me for my original desire to be the boss of me. It's like, I'll be good. So I think these two ways of relating to the authority problem can be well expressed in the difference between cats and dogs. This is a quote from Marie-Louise von Franz. She's a Jungian psychoanalyst, and this is what she said. And you can see a kind of summary up here of what she said under cats, and a little bit of what she said under dogs too. She doesn't say much about dogs, but we'll get onto that. So this is what she says about cats. The cat, in contrast to the dog, has never sold its soul to man. The cat has always a kind of egocentric reserve somewhere. The cat says to us, "You may stroke me and you may serve me, but it never becomes your slave. And if you annoy it, it just walks out on you, and therefore the cat stands as an image of something independent and sure of itself. The cat is not very amiable, but it is very true to itself." And I think anybody who's ever owned a cat or had dealings with a cat will recognise the truth of that statement. And here is a little bit of what I had to say about dogs, and it comes from my book Above the Battleground, and I'll be reading a little bit later from this book as well in relation to Alchemy and Carl Jung. But first, let's start with dogs. So this is a chat from a chapter on guilt. Social media is full of videos in which dog owners catch their beloved pet red-handed, sneaking food, chewing an expensive shoe, lying on the good couch. Dogs seem sensitive to guilt and wear it on their sleeve. Their reactions are immediate, often dramatic, hence the videos. Being pack animals, dogs operate according to a social hierarchy. Instinctively, they respond to a leader, an authority. Cats, of course, are another story. Now I'm going to turn to a fascinating book I came across recently. Here's a picture of the cover, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. It's a very, very interesting book where it looks at the influence of the Western frontier in the development of the American identity. But what we're most interested in here is the kind of differences between the Western frontier and the East Coast, the settled East Coast, looking at New England and further down the East Coast, and that part that became very British. That's where the first kind of major settlements occurred. You've got the cities, and then you've got the West Frontier, which was always pushing westward. And just as one frontier had been met and some established dwellings, etc., developed there, along with a little bit of infrastructure, maybe begrudgingly, people would pick up and move on to another frontier. And so the whole process was constantly going on. There was an independent spirit that the regulators in the cities, much to their annoyance, couldn't rein in. They wanted people to stay around the cities and be under the civic control, but there was a certain individualism that always pressed out into the wilderness, didn't want to be reined in. And these are some of the words that go with those movements, those people who loved moving on to another frontier and another frontier. Individualism was prized by them very much so. Independence. There was a certain antisocial element, and that didn't mean that they didn't like people. The antisocial means that they didn't want to be bound in by the requirements that are needed when you have a large community. Freedom is what was prized by them. So if you look at those characteristics, you can see why I've put them under the cats category. I'm not saying they are cats, but you're getting what I'm saying. These are just some fun and imaginative ways of exploring the two responses to the authority problem. And I'll get into more of this and how relevant it is to ourselves a bit later. With the East Coast, we have the development of the civic spirit, the what is good for the whole, the idea of the greater good. We can't just let people be individuals and do what they want, because what happens to the greater good? Who is being served that way? If everybody just does what they want, there would be mayhem and chaos, and you might get what you want, but that's not necessarily good for the greater good, for the whole of society. And conscience is a big thing at play in the more civic, government regulated areas, order and control. And now I'm going to read some great excerpts from this book. So here's what Frederick Turner has to say about the frontier. As has been indicated, the frontier is productive of individualism. Complex society is precipitated by the wilderness into a kind of primitive organisation based on the family. So from complex society and all that reins us in, people move westward and they then enter into a kind of primitive arrangement, which just means a basic. This book was written in the late 1800s, so it uses words like primitive, but what it means is basic survival kind of situation. Yes, so complex society is precipitated by the wilderness into a kind of primitive organisation based on the family. The tendency is antisocial. It produces antipathy to control, and particularly to any direct control. The tax gatherer is viewed as a representative of oppression. And in contrast to the freedom and kind of wildness of life in the Western frontier, we have just a little bit here about the East Coast and the orators of the East Coast. The Old Dominion, meaning the settled areas, has long been celebrated for producing great orators, the ablest metaphysicians in policy, men that can split hairs in all abstruse questions of political economy. Okay, but now we have some of the bad sides of the Western frontier mentality. But the democracy, born of the free land, strong in selfishness and individualism, intolerant of administrative experience and education, and pressing individual liberty beyond its proper bounds, has its dangers as well as its benefits. Individualism in America has allowed a laxity in regard to governmental affairs, which has rendered possible the spoils system and all the manifest evils that follow from the lack of a highly developed civic spirit. So the spoils system, you get in first, you get the stuff, you conquer, you're entitled to the spoils. So the whole idea of the Wild West is what this is about. A little bit further, it talks about the gamblers and the desperados of the Wild West. But then it talks about some good things to do with the Wild West and that free spirit. You have the humour, the bravery and rude strength, just rude basic strength, as well as the vices. So because of those vices, apart from wanting the East regulators and the governments being established, and apart from them wanting to rein the people in so they could have some control over civil society, have not a split between the two, they also, because they were Puritan and highly religious, they also felt concern for the moral welfare of the people going into the Western the Western frontier, I should say. And so a lot of missionaries were sent out to the Western frontier to try and take care of the spiritual education of the wild and free people on the frontier, the desperados and the gamblers. This is what someone wrote about, from this side of the equation, wrote about that kind of thing. But what will become of the West if her prosperity rushes up to such a majesty of power, while those great institutions linger which are necessary to form the mind and the conscience and the heart of that vast world? It must not be permitted. So they were very much concerned with creating a conscience, informing the conscience, religiously really, of the people in the West. And here's another description of the traits of the Western frontier. That coarseness and strength, combined with acuteness and inquisitiveness, that practical, inventive turn of mind, quick to find expedients, that masterful grasp of material things, lacking in the artistic but powerful to effect great ends, that restless, nervous energy, that dominant individualism, working for good and for evil, and with all that buoyancy and exuberance which comes from freedom, these are traits of the frontier. Now, what are some of the perils of organisation in a civic society where there is government and there is the idea of rules and regulations and order for the greater good? Well, if overdone, you have tyranny, and then there is no freedom. But if there are no rules and regulations, ultimately there is just a lot of fear in this kind of situation, the Wild West, and that can lead to limiting freedom as well, because some people might have freedom in terms of doing what they want, but they will always do it at the expense of others. And so you start to fear for your safety when there is too much freedom. So very broadly, we could say the West was self-confident and very self-assertive. The East was concerned more with doing the right thing. The East, we could say, was to do with tradition, with let's build on the tradition and the knowledge and the customs of Europe. We'll build on that and we'll use those customs to create a civil society. We'll be as perfect as we can according to very well-reasoned arguments, logic, laws of economy, etc. Okay, so now I come to a German philosopher called Georg Hegel and his theory of the progress of history, or the engine of change of history and major social developments. So he says that a thesis or one proposition will generate its opposite, its antithesis, and the conflict and the tension between them will finally be resolved in a third and higher principle called the synthesis. So it will result in a synthesis that represents progress and something, a better situation than what they started with. So this idea of a thesis, an antithesis leading to a synthesis is in philosophy is called a dialectic. So in philosophy, way back into the Greek times, the way that they would come up with ideas about something was to first propose a thesis, so one idea, and then to get a better understanding of that idea, they'd come up with an opposite proposition. And so it's by having these opposites that they could get a better understanding of each thing itself. So they would have a thesis and then its opposite, the antithesis, and then they would come up with a synthesis which was somehow representing the best of both worlds in a way in which they were no longer in conflict. They were supportive to each other. Now, Hegel says that this process occurs in history when we have something like, we'll call this a thesis, that individualism is important, independence, the freedom to live without the restraints of an overarching power. That would be one proposition, a thesis. Then we come up with an opposite. The opposite is the civic spirit, that we need laws and an overarching power to provide for the greater good. So that's an antithesis. And Hegel says that the progress of history occurs when you have these two things emerge and conflict and tension, and that the conflict and tension isn't a bad thing because eventually, well, it's providing for growth in his theory, and eventually these two will sort themselves out in a synthesis which will lead to a higher kind of state of overall society. That was what Hegel thought would happen. So here I will read a little bit from this book, Mozart and the Enlightenment. There's a passage that talks about the Enlightenment in a way that kind of affirms Hegel's idea that out of conflict comes a synthesis in which things stabilise for a while. So this is what the author of this book, Nicholas Till, has to say. The 18th century has often been portrayed as an era of extraordinary tranquility and grace, flanked by two violent and turbulent centuries, an age in which social order and political stability allowed the development of an amiable civilization that combined moderation and manners with critical inquiry and a rational program of social reform which was conducted with passion tempered by wit. So wit, W-I-T, refers to using rationality and intelligence to reason things out. Passion refers to what we want, what we want to do in life, what we feel will bring us pleasure. If you're into Freud, you could almost say one represents the pleasure principle and one represents the reality principle. This is what you want to do, but this is the reality of the situation, and this is how things need to be tempered. But what this author is saying is that it seems generally to be said that the 18th century, which was called the Age of Enlightenment, represented a kind of synthesis, a harmony between these two oppositions. But then it goes on to say that this chimeral vision, which means like a beautiful oasis, should have collapsed so brutally into the bloodshed of the French Revolution and the chaos of the wars that subsequently swept Europe has, of course, led historians to question the foundations upon which the apparent stability of 18th century culture was based, and to unearth tensions lurking beneath the surface calm. So here, what this person is saying is that there was a synthesis of sorts, a kind of stable period in history, but there were still tensions within that synthesis that led to another period of conflict, the brutality of the French Revolution and subsequent wars. And here we can come to a diagram by another philosopher, Hannah Arendt. She preferred to be known as a political theorist and a philosopher, but she had studied Hegel, amongst many others. She was a lecturer, etc. And this diagram comes from her book, The Life of the Mind. And it shows part of Hegel's theory where you have a thesis and an antithesis culminating in a synthesis, but then the process occurs all over again. So that's what's shown here. A thesis will eventually lead to an antithesis. So out of a stable period, you'll have conflict between two opposite propositions, two opposite thoughts about the way to do things, about way life should be lived. So we have these two opposites, and out of the conflict between them, a third higher state will be arrived at, another synthesis will be found. And then from this synthesis, let's say the Enlightenment period, for example, eventually something will change, something will shift things that then another thesis and antithesis, another conflict, a pair of opposites that was always in there, but was kind of not too much at the fore. The peace and stability was more at the fore. Well, something happens and those elements emerge and the conflict begins again until another synthesis is found. And then out of that, eventually, any tensions will emerge, a thesis, an antithesis, opposites. And this period, this situation continues forever. In Hegel's view, infinite progress occurs as we're getting to a higher and higher state. Now, what Carl Jung would say is that this process in history represents a psychological process within ourselves. These elements are within each of us. And this brings me back to the Course in Miracles and the two approaches to the perceived or the believed separation from God and the whole authority problem. So we could say some people tend more towards God's a tyrant. This is not conscious. You can be a devout Christian, but unconsciously there is a belief in God as a tyrant and that you don't want anything to do with him and you're going to do your thing. And so you have an anti-authority stance in life. It's that belief about your relationship with God is then reflected and filters through into your relationships with authority figures in the world. So your relationship with authority figures in the world helps you know what your current issue you're working through in terms of your relationship with the authority figure of God, and that relationship is an unconscious one. So if this kind of thing is very important to you on this side, perhaps there is a healing that needs to occur in terms of your belief that God is a tyrant and God's will for you is not the same as your will for yourself, that the wills are different and that he just wants you to be a slave, that and the only way you can be happy is to stay away from him, stay away from the authorities in order to do your own thing, because God doesn't want anything good for you. And on this side, we have the idea that I better do the right thing. Doing the right thing, control and perfectionism in form. The rules, the regulations, what I do, if I do things perfectly, diligently, correctly, the way they are supposed to be done, then I will be pleasing God. Whether or not you have a conscious concept of a relationship with God is beside the point. It's what is going on unconsciously. So Jung is saying opposites that are out there in the world playing out on the historical level, like Hegel talks about, are actually playing out within your mind. They are parts of your parts of your psychological makeup. So here I'll read a little bit from Jung, and this is coming from my book Above the Battleground Again. So this is from a subsection called Little Earthquakes, where it talks about something shifting in our lives. Something happens to precipitate these opposites emerging, but these opposites were always within our mind. That trials start the psychological alchemical process going seems to be a given. Now, alchemy was concerned with reconciling opposites, so reconciling this tension and coming up with a synthesis as well. Ultimately, that synthesis really represents a state of wholeness, and in terms of A Course in Miracles, we're relating that to somehow having an experience that relates to knowing ourselves as part of that Christ mind. And that really means not having shame and guilt. So again, that trials start the psychological alchemical process going seems to be a given. According to Jung, progress calls for a darkening periodically, for a widening of consciousness to occur, symbolically reflected in the sudden darkness at the time of Christ's death on the cross, a Jungian symbol for the pain of being suspended between opposites. There is a period of disorientation as the ground shifts, while stability dissolves and opposites, which were always present, become clear. This can happen abruptly through a personal circumstance or a major global event. We can become aware of our shadow in the increasingly polarized world of politics, for example, the inner split reflected in the outer. Fate, as Jung says, will always lend us a hand. And here is a quote from Jung. Today, humanity, as never before, is split into two apparently irreconcilable halves. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That is to say, when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves. Now, I don't know whether I agree with Jung that the world has to be torn into opposing halves for us to be able to become aware of the opposing halves within ourselves. I think the world is always, being a projection of the ego, is always torn between opposing halves. But sometimes in the world we can say that the split between opposing halves does seem more pronounced than at other times. And that gives us an opportunity to become aware of those splits within our own psychological makeup. So if there seems to be a bigger split in the world right now between the kind of two values here, we can use that as an opportunity to become aware of those split within our own mind, and of those two aspects, those two responses to the authority problem within our own mind. We can become aware of it by how we look upon each of these sides. Because if we see one side and kind of are repulsed by it or antagonistic towards it, then that can let us know that there are good elements of that side that we're not embracing within ourselves because of the so-called bad elements of that side that repulse us. So in this respect, I'd like to read a quote from the Course. His single purpose, meaning the Holy Spirit's single purpose, his single purpose unifies the halves of you that you perceive as separate. And each forgives the other, that he may accept his other half as part of him. So we hate what we see as other to us, opposite to us, but it's actually part of us, and what we're hating in that part is a part of us that we feel guilty about and shameful about, but haven't owned up to it. And so the Course's forgiveness process is, you have not made me upset. You have just shown me what I have condemned within myself. And so now that I can let you off the hook and realize that it's my own self-condemnation, the section in the Course about the self-accused, it's my own self-condemnation that has made me upset. I can forgive you in that I know that you are not the cause of my upset. My cause of my upset is my own self-condemnation. And then I can open it up to forgiveness. And then I can accept you as my brother and my sister in Christ, part of that oneness. And that's why the Course says that we may accept our other half as part of us. So finally, another thing to consider with opposites of any kind really is that we'll feel victimized by the other. So one side will feel victimized by the seeming control that the other wants to impose on it in this situation. This side will feel victimized by the kind of lawlessness and the lack of cooperation in terms of the greater good and civic spirit that this side represents. So that's another thing about opposites. We'll always feel victimized and at odds. One person will be the victim and one person will be the victimizer. Each has the face of innocence themselves, thinking that the other person is the bad guy. I hope this has been of some help to you in navigating these opposites within yourself. That's the most important thing. Notice these opposites within yourself, and you can work on your relationship with authority figures in your life and with your relationship with God. God bless, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.